Hello, in this video I'll talk about the music of Japanese composer Toru Takemitsu and how it can be used as a basis for improvisation. And I'll focus on one composition, All in Twilight, written for solo guitar, that I recorded together with guitarist David Härenstam on this new album with the same name. And there's so much one can say about Takemitsu's musical universe, how he approaches time and space and silence, and how he manages to combine elements of Western art music with Japanese traditional music and even elements from jazz and pop. But I will focus on the melodic and harmonic aspects of his music in this video, and I'll start with talking about some of the things that fascinates me with his music. And then I'll go into how we approached improvising on it. So pretty much in the beginning of the first movement, we get this beautiful ascending phrase. Not only does this phrase have a distinct Takemitsu character, we can also look at the first three notes and find a recurring motif in Takemitsu's writing, the so-called C motif, which is used a lot to symbolize water in his music. And this motif originally comes from the pitches E flat, E and A. Which, based on the German note names of these pitches, S, E, A, gives you the word C, and it's one of many examples of how Takemitsu connects to nature in his writing. Now there are lots of really gorgeous chords and arpeggios in Takemitsu's music, sometimes with one or two notes that seem to be a bit outside. And it's actually quite common in his writing that he builds a chord from a particular scale and then he adds notes that are outside of that to get some extra color. And one example can be heard in the first movement, in this chord arpeggio. Which can be analyzed as an E half diminished chord, but with an added C sharp and an F sharp, which would be the 13th and 9th of that chord. And we also have this beautiful passage of arpeggios where unexpected colors are emerging gradually. So if we look at the second bar here, we have a quite interesting combination of a C minor major 7th chord with the notes of a F sharp minor triad appearing above. And in the sixth bar we have this descending arpeggio where an E minor 9th chord is unfolding, but where you also get the flat 5th, a B flat, one octave below the natural 5th, almost like a blue note. And there is also this interesting combination of notes that we find in the third movement. And if we look at the first half of this bar, we find some sort of dark A sus chord with a flat 9. And then he continues with this lighter upper structure chord on top of that, like a D major 7th chord. Played in a descending zigzag kind of pattern. Another common thing in Takemitsu's writing is the use of so-called symmetric scales, and in this composition he uses a lot of the octatonic scale, or the diminished scale as it's known in jazz. For instance, we can find it in a chord arpeggio like this in the first movement. And in the second movement we have different chord voicings based on this scale, moving around over an E pedal. the third movement, we find an ascending pattern like this one. But it should be pointed out that even though he frequently uses this kind of symmetric scale, it's never predictable, because usually he will combine it with other things and even add notes that are outside of these scales to keep the music fresh and alive. Another quality to me with this music is its harmonic ambiguity, meaning that it's often unclear where a certain chord is going, making it difficult to label them, and you can often imagine different bass notes working with the same chord. And a good example of this can be found in the second movement, where the starting chord really sets the mood. And this chord doesn't contain any third, so you can't really tell if it's based on a major or minor scale, but with a flat sixth it seems to imply a minor scale. But then after a while, as the melody unfolds, you get this unexpected motif which contains both a major seventh and a major third. And this melody seems to float on top of the other sounds, which is interesting because when you hear it together, you can sort of reevaluate and re-hear the underlying chord together with the new colors. Another interesting aspect of Takemitsu's writing is how he manages to go in and out of tonal centers, and this can be heard a lot in the fourth movement, where he stays for longer periods in one tonality. And in the following example, he's repeating a motif in A-flat mixed religion, but then breaks out of that tonality by introducing a variation of the same motif taken from the diminished scale. And this is something he uses a lot in the fourth movement to move away from the established tonalities. And now I'll present some of the ways for how we approached improvising over this composition.
So one of the ways for how we added improvisation to this music was by simply starting the movements with free introductions. And this was done by the piano for the first movement and by the guitar for the second. And the way we approached these improvisations was very open. It could be over the general mood of the piece or as something that was contrasting with the music. But we didn't set out to use any particular material, but rather left it open to the moment. Another way of getting into improvisation was by staying on one chord or sonority and build the improvisation from there. And this can be heard in the piano solo in the middle of the second movement, which is partly based on the octatonic or diminished scale. And this solo has a steady pulse in 3/4, which is something that we added as a complement to the rest of the piece, which has more of a floating character. And for the third movement, I created an ostinato that we used as a foundation for a guitar solo. And this was based on a slight variation of a figure taken from the original. Using this figure seemed to make sense musically, since it was already repeated in the original, and since it seemed to capture a lot of the melodic and rhythmic character of this movement. The most common way for how we added improvisational elements to this composition by far was by repeating passages that we found in the music and letting the improvisation take place there. And the length of these passages could vary quite a lot, from 2 bars up to 12 bars. In some of the sections, the composed material was treated quite loosely, and the improvisation was based more on the harmonic progression. This was the case with the ending piano solo in the second movement. In other sections, like the piano solo in the end of the first movement, we moved between using the written part together with the piano improvisation and using chords that were based on this part. For the guitar solo in the first movement, we also repeated a passage from the original, but this time we took out some of the bars from the composition to give more space for the guitar initially. This also gave us the feeling of the music developing when these bars were inserted later. In one of the solos, a piano improvisation based on the third movement, we also added some extra bars after the first and second bar from the original. The idea behind this was to give more space for the improvisation, and in the last repeat, these extra bars were omitted to create a feeling that the intensity was gradually increasing. For the fourth movement, the approach was somewhat different than in the rest of the suite, in that the piano generally functions more as an added, improvised layer, floating on top of what the guitar plays. In general, we went with a fairly laid-back role for the piano in this movement, adding musical commentaries to the guitar, and sometimes playing along with it in a toned-down way. In some of the places, the piano has more of a prominent role in improvisations. And these improvisations soon took on a folkloristic character as the music evolved, that seemed to set the mood for the whole movement. And this approach also seemed to reinforce the brighter quality of this movement in comparison with the rest of the suite.
So thank you for watching. I hope this video gave you some insights to Takemitsu's musical language and hopefully some inspiration to explore this music yourself.